Hello, this is John with WesleyGospel.com. I want to take a moment to talk about the priesthood of the believer, the priesthood of all believers. And there's good aspects about this doctrine, but there's also some dangerous aspects about it, and you need to be careful of it. First off, where's this coming from? Where in the scriptures is this taught? Well, it's in 1 Peter 2:5. Ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. And I think there might be another verse in there, but that's good for now. And this is to say that literally every Christian that has the Holy Spirit, that is the temple of the Holy Spirit, that's been regenerated and baptized in the Holy Spirit, literally is a priest to God. And what does that mean with regard to our relationship to churches? Well, number one, the number one counselor in all spiritual matters with regard to churches is the Holy Spirit himself. So the Holy Spirit is there to help us, guide us. He's our guide, Jesus said. And so he's gonna lead us and guide us into all truth. Now, does that mean he's always gonna infallibly put us in places, in churches that are where we need to be right then and there? I would have to say it's easier said than done because of human imperfection and human error. But then again, I would also say it depends on the calling that you have. If you are called to evangelism, the Holy Spirit might very well guide you into all kinds of different churches. But if you're not called to that, it's more likely that the Holy Spirit will guide you to the right church to just plant down and be a normal family man. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I think that there are some dangerous tendencies with the teaching on the priesthood of all believers. It started off with the apostles here, and I would have to say probably even Jesus taught it because he was breaking away from the Pharisees who believed themselves to be the priests. So the dangerous tendency is people like Frank Viola, who wrote Pagan Christianity in 2008, in which you have this anti-clericalism, this anti-pastor sort of teaching floating around in charismatic Christianity. And the idea that it doesn't matter if you go to an official church with a pulpit or if you just stay at home and have Bible study groups with gifts of the Spirit operating. And it's neither here nor there because we're all a holy priesthood. Stop right there. Time out. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus teach that the ideal situation, the biblical situation, is to be in a church with a pastor with a pulpit. That is taught in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, and those are called the pastoral epistles because they were written by the Apostle Paul for Timothy and Titus, who were pastors of churches. So the dangerous tendency with the priesthood of believers in 1 Peter 2:5 is to say that we don't need pastors anymore. Everybody's a pastor. That's wrong. That is wrong teaching. And so we do need pastors. However, now I'm going to swing the pendulum to the other side of the spectrum. Why did Martin Luther break away from the Catholic Church in the 1500s? Well, again, it's the holy priesthood concept coming to bear. Just because 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus say the ideal situation is to have a pastor, just because Hebrews says we're supposed to not forsake the assembling of believers, just because the Ten Commandments says we're supposed to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and therefore we need to go to church in order to do that, there are still other problems that can come into the picture, and that is spiritual declension. Spiritual declension, in other words, the opposite of revival, the opposite of spiritual revival. And spiritual declension is where you have people like big profile leaders in the Pentecostal churches falling into sexual sin, creating a sense of low morale all across the board among the leaders, among the laity. And then you end up with spiritual declension. People start losing their faith in the church, and therefore they leave churches, and as a result of leaving churches, they also, here's the dangerous part, they also stop being a Christian. That also part is the real concern here. And we need to remember that no matter what happens in denominations or quote-unquote institutional churches, that Christians that have the Holy Spirit are a holy priesthood. And as a result of that, right, if there are declensions that happen among leaders in denominations, this is no argument against all churches whatsoever under all circumstances. What it does mean is that we need to, in times like that, in times of sifting, sorting, and testing, we need to rely on the Holy Spirit to give us guidance to find a good church to stay plugged into. Now, an overly simplistic attitude, an overly simplistic mentality about church attendance is not the answer. We need to rely on the Holy Spirit in conscience and personal observation to be in the right church, not just any church. Okay, and so that's one of the reasons why the pastoral epistles were written in the first place, to qualify and to help you to define what the right church is. And so we can't have this overly simplistic mentality that any church is good enough for us and that fulfills all the requirements of the right church in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Another thing that's just really problematic with having an overly simplistic, what does simplistic mean? It means oversimplification. So that's what simplistic means, oversimplification of our thinking with regard to a subject. It's called simplistic. Having an oversimplified, simplistic mentality about church attendance, so that if anybody commits a serious sin in a pastoral position, now you're going to turn your back on God and be an agnostic or something. What? Why? What? If you're gonna rubber band that extremely, then you had a spiritual problem in the first place, right? So the number one thing needs to be holiness theology in your personal life. You know, your personal devotional life, that needs to be number one, because no matter what happens in the church, outside the church, or any other place, you're still walking with God after all is said and done. And you know, sometimes people get laid off jobs. Sometimes people get laid off companies, and they're what they would call between jobs. All right. If you have the Holy Spirit, you can be between churches. All right. There might be some really spiritually toxic pastoral settings going on. I mean, there's a lot of that. All right. So that doesn't mean you never try to find a church. Right. We're like the people of Israel. We have to wander until we hit the promised land. And we can't just give up on church altogether. We have to keep on going. You know, and sooner or later, you're going to find people that are spiritually minded. They're not perfect, but spiritually minded. And they're not, they have a sincere fear of God and are trying to live for the Lord and not just compromise all the time. And so it requires patience and perseverance to find that. And And even though, let's say you do find it and it goes well for a couple of years, well, again, it's the Holy Spirit's number one, and you're a holy priesthood. But you can't have this oversimplistic, like no criticism, no critique, no critical thinking whatsoever. I don't mean to say critique or criticism. I mean critical thinking. You don't throw your critical thinking faculties out when you go to a church, because when you do that, you're doing exactly what the people did in Martin Luther's time, where they had absolutely no critical thinking going on whatsoever. They trusted the Catholic priests like a blind guide's leading the blind, right? We can't do that. That's why Martin Luther broke away from the Catholic Church, to get us back to the gospel again. Because the Catholic priests at the time in the Renaissance were blinding the people from Romans. People didn't even know that Romans was the gospel anymore. So there are times where there are spiritual declensions in the organized churches where we have to say, all right, it's just me and the Holy Spirit, until we have to find somewhere else to go. I'm between churches right now. I'm between jobs. But we have to understand our priorities when we look at church. It can't have an oversimplified idea. There are some things more important than other things. All right? The gospel of Jesus Christ is more important than which church you go to. The Bible is more important than which pastor you select, right? But God, an experience of God and His presence and His guidance is more important than having friends at church. I mean, there are just certain things that you have to create on the Christian priority list here. But on the other end of the spectrum, one of the things that's really ridiculous is that, I've heard stories of people, they get hurt at a church and now they turn their whole back on Jesus Christ as a result. Why? Why'd you go that far? That wasn't necessary. Jesus didn't do that. Okay. And so when we look at church, we have to understand, look, you can't oversimplify this situation. There are some things that come above church, namely the Bible. Are you reading the Bible? Or do you have this oversimplistic attitude about Christianity where it's just a church-based form of Christianity? Bible will give you the sight, the goggles, the insight to be able to have clarity about all of these things. It's when I think the biggest problem is when people turn away from the Bible and they have a careless attitude about their spiritual life, and they just go to a church and they think that that's all that needs to be done. That is wrong. And then when their pastor, sexually abuses women or falls into porn addiction or something like this, now they're not a Christian anymore? Well, you were barely a Christian in the first place. As if to say pastors can't fall? As if pastors are not men? I mean, come on, you were barely a Christian in the first place. Now you're turning your whole back on God because of that? That's ridiculous. So I think a lot of people, they just have an overly simplistic attitude, hyper simplified understanding about Christianity and church. 1 Peter 2:5, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. What are spiritual sacrifices? I don't know. It's not really described here. But it seems to me that your entire life, everything between Monday and Saturday, it is devotion to God from the heart. It's when people roll their eyes at that they end up in cults. Because they have no discernment whatsoever. God bless you out there. This is John with WesleyGospel.com.